All right, welcome everybody. My name is Tim Snellings. I was the Development Services Director in Butte County from 2005 through 2019. And I'm here with Pete Calarco, who was my assistant then. Pete will introduce himself in just a moment. Thanks, Pete, for being here. Butte County, for those that don't know, is located about 70 miles north of Sacramento, Northern California. And it is the site of the Camp Fire, which burned over 153,000 acres in 2018, destroyed over 14,000 homes and over 4,000 other structures, garages, outbuildings, and tragically lost 85 lives in that fire. So it was one of the most devastating fires, I believe, in California history in the country. And we're going to talk about the Camp Fire and Pete's experience in working in the Emergency Operations Center. We're actually going to do this in two parts. We're going to focus in this first part of the series on the Emergency Operations Center, the response, and the role of land use planner during the fire, an emergency. And then second, we'll talk about land use planning in general, more general terms, and how it relates to preparation and planning, and then response and recovery from a disaster or fire. We're going to begin, and I'm going to turn it over to Pete to talk about who he is and how he got into this, how he gets connected with an emergency operations center as a land use planner. So take it away, Pete.
Sure, Tim. So, right, Pete Calarco, Assistant Director, Butte County Development Services. So here in Butte County, Development Services is planning, building, code enforcement. I've been here about 15 years, and during that time period, been through a number of fires and disasters, the EOC, and here as a development representative. DDS, our department, serves in the Emergency Operations Center in Butte County and a number of different capacities. So that's directly in the EOC, as well as during the initial damage assessment after disasters, and then the recovery phases. So we've been involved in all of those. And it's a key role here in the county.
Okay. So Pete, I want to start back in 2008. That's, I think, when you first got involved with the EOC, the Emergency Operations Center. So we're going to just call it EOC from here forward. And first of all, describe, before we talk about some of the specifics, describe what an Emergency Operations Center and EOC is.
Yeah, the county will activate its EOC during a declared disaster. An EOC is organizational structure under the National Incident Management System that sets a standardization for how to support the incident. And most of what Butte County EOC does is logistics and support structures for the disaster, including care and shelter, public health and safety for the community. So there's a series of branches within an EOC. The one that I serve in is the plan section. Other sections would include logistics, operations, and management within the EOC. The benefit of a national incident management system for an EOC is that it standardizes the terms and processes so that wherever there's a disaster, other communities, other agencies come in and serve, and or we can go serve in other communities. The system is common throughout California and throughout the United States, so there's a benefit to that. And processes, it also serves as the conduit for capturing the events and purchasing and costs in order to qualify for reimbursement, which is also an important part of a disaster.
So are these, describe the different levels of disaster, that like local and state and federal. I mean, how does the tiering work first, if you could explain that for a second?
Yeah, there's a local proclamation of a disaster. So that would be your city council or your board of supervisors declaring an emergency or a disaster. The state will also, depending on the magnitude, can declare a state disaster. And further, the federal government can also declare a federal disaster. And depending on those levels, will also dictate the kinds of funding streams and the protocol you go through to respond to the disaster.
Okay. And there's a public health declaration somewhere in there as well, public health officer typically?
On certain disasters, another component would be a public health disaster, and then that opens up another series of resources and processes and potential reimbursements for a community's disaster.
And this is all spelled out in the county's emergency operations plan?
Emergency operations plan outlines those, and we support that plan through our emergency management office and a county administrator. We work through that to support that plan.
So in the emergency operations center, you're not the only one in there, are you? You said there's other sections. Like, how
Yeah.
many people might there be in an emergency in the emergency operations center?
Yeah, it can vary from 8 or 10 up to maybe 30 people directly
Okay.
in the room, and that's not including then a number of staff support that's occurring outside the emergency operations room. I should also clarify that our EOC is separate from the incident command center. Like in a fire, fire agency or CAL FIRE will establish an incident command center. That's the group that is battling the direct emergency or disaster that's in place, and our county EOC then helps support that incident command center.
Okay. And that's what you said, running the like evacuation like of animals and as well as people, finding shelter for them. And there's a whole host of services that are offered and coordinated through the Emergency Operations Center.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Is it usual and common for a planning person to be in the EOC?
Not real common. I think the title plans and intelligence section will naturally draw people to someone in a planning agency. But my experience there is that it's a whole other animal. You know, in our day jobs, we in planning, building, development, and so on, do not normally deal with disasters and emergencies. You know, we can prepare environmental documents, we can process building permits, but the pace and the intensity is quite different, and it's on a topic that we do not usually have a lot of exposure to. But the benefits of somebody with our background is that we do have experience in coordinating information and running meetings, collecting data, and communicating and staying calm under a lot of pressure.
Well, certainly being as familiar with the county as planning agencies are is of great value and benefit to an emergency operations center to know the lay of the land, a lot of the resources in the county, you know, a lot of the facilities, and just the hands-on land use experience does come in handy, I'm sure, in the EOC.
Yeah, the major transportation routes, the communities, the concentration of residents, development areas that we're familiar with, the topography, all of those things come in handy, as well as the agencies or districts that you're familiar with throughout your county that may be affected during disaster.
It does seem also like many other counties, many of our peers are starting to show up in EOCs more and more as there are more disasters, and specifically wildfires in California. And so that's a lot of the purpose of this conversation we're having, is to provide information to them and to assist them as well as students in classes. And so that's hopefully what they'll get out of this is a little bit of a flavor of why you would be in an EOC. There's training that you also went through to prepare yourself to be in the EOC, right?
Whole series of trainings, yep, that are consistent with or offered by the NIMS, National Incident Management System. Many of those can be done online, and then we've been fortunate to have some of the higher level trainings also at no cost, no direct cost to us, sponsored through another agency that we've gotten the upper level management type training as well. That's very helpful, and to the degree it prepares you for a disaster, but there is nothing like being in the EOC itself to work through those processes and
Right.
adapt based on the situation, and adapt the best you can to perform in those situations.
Right. All of the simulations and training are to get you prepared to really be able to adapt, as you say, because no incident can be fully, trained for, because each incident is unique in and of itself.
Yeah, and you also establish relationships as a result of being in an EOC during a disaster situation that you may not have had that benefit otherwise. There's a number of other departments that we connect with in an EOC that maybe we don't have a lot of direct connection with in our routine jobs, and then that connection that we've established in the EOC benefits, I think, the whole of the organization in a non-emergency situation as well.
Okay, so let's kind of play this out a little bit. If we could start in 2008, and just as you were introduced into the EOC, there were some things that happened in the year 2008 that may have, and I think actually prepared Butte County in a lot of ways for the Camp Fire in 2018. So talk a little bit about your experience in 2008.
Sure. So we activated EOC with some what were, in hindsight, some smaller fires. I was in the Situation Status Unit, which is a branch of the Plans and Intelligence section of an EOC.
And
And
what
so,
is that, by the way? What is plans and intelligence? Just briefly.
Plans and Intelligence is gathering information about the incident and disseminating that through the other branches of the EOC, preparing an incident action plan, and running the planning cycle within the EOC. So in your Emergency Operations Center, you'll establish a operational period for your plan. And that's the process, is this continual planning process within an EOC where you gather information, conduct meetings, set incident objectives for each of the branches. We gather that information, compile it with the incident information we have available in that operational period, and produce an incident action plan. That gets circulated, and then you start that planning process again, and you go through your entire incident through cycles of planning processes. The incident action plan will establish operational periods that may vary from a few hours to 12 hours, 24 hours, or a week, and then that we use the intensity or the amount of change occurring within a incident to dictate the time frame for an incident
Okay,
action plan.
great. So back to 2008, there were some things going on in
Yeah.
the world of fire. What happened in 2008?
Yeah. So we had a few fires. Then we had, I believe it was the Humboldt fire that, and I may be a little off on my numbers, but something like 20 or 30,000 acres were burned. This was also followed very closely with what ultimately became named as the Butte lightning complex. So there were so many fires as a result of a lightning storm, in addition to the other fires I was referring to that led up to this, that the names of the incident then got changed to the Butte lightning complex. And that burned, I think, close to 89,000 acres and destroyed over 200 dwelling units in that time period. So that was the biggest disaster I've ever been involved in.
Right,
Essentially the first one that I've been included in.
right. And that was on the east side of Paradise, correct?
Right. There were fires, lightning fires that were on the east side of Paradise, as well as fires that burned up to the south portion of Paradise. So very close. And it was incredible that it, at that point, did not go into the town of Paradise.
Right. And there were some problems I know that happened with roads clogging up, and maybe we'll talk about that later. But I know that during the evacuation that ensued, from that fire, the roads clogged. I mean, there were only 4 routes out of Paradise, actually 3 at that time,
Yeah.
and it was a mess. And
Yep. A lot of lessons learned that they were applied later and were
okay,
found very valuable.
all right. So let's fast forward, if we could, to the EOC. Maybe we should stop before we get to the campfire. Let's stop in 2017, the year that we thought was going to be the worst year we ever dealt with,
Yeah.
and describe kind of what happened in 2017 and how many times was the EOC activated in 17?
I don't have that exact count. We had probably 4 or 5 major fires
Okay.
in that year. That was also the year that we had the spillway incident. So there was lots of EOC happening in 2017.
Yes. I know we thought, man, that was a brutal year, and man, we got through it. So now we roll into 2018.
Yeah,
We're getting through the summer. Things are looking good. We're into
and we're
November
yeah.
and
So
thinking,
2017, we were still in the disaster recovery of the 2017 fires, well into 2018.
okay,
Um, and you hope the best you can that there aren't any further disasters. And we thought really by the time we got through October, we had cleared the fire season. And
okay. So now we come to
how wrong
November
we were.
8th. Now we come to November 8th. It's been 220 days plus since it's rained. We're on the tail end of a drought, and the campfire happens. Fire starts at about 6:15, 6:30
Yeah.
a.m. And
Yep.
describe your day, if you can, and how the EOC worked that day.
Sure. So I leave my house in Chico at 7:30 to get to work at 8, and I look up and see a plume, a deep dark plume in the sky. And the wishful thinking in my brain at that time was that maybe it's one of those weird storm clouds, and knowing that it probably wasn't. Um, as I get into Oroville, where our office and county center are, very quickly then report to our emergency operation building and started to gather information about the incident. Um, we weren't in the EOC for too long before it became pretty clear that all of the town and surrounding areas, town of Paradise and surrounding county areas, were designated in evacuation order. And it's pretty tough to be in the EOC when a big disaster is happening. That was pretty difficult. I found that I had a few minutes to step outside and texted my immediate siblings to pray for the town of Paradise because it was burning.
Hmm.
And that's a tough experience to go through, and you know that whatever you're going through is nothing like the people in the disaster are going through.
Yeah.
And so we wind up not talking a lot about what we experience because it pales by comparison to what um, the tragedy and heroism and the miracle that happened in order to
Right.
get
So
those
at
people out of that area.
at the early stages, there was no fighting the fire. The fire was in an area that was unapproachable because of the roads that were inaccessible. And so the fire, and they tried to, I know, originally thought about attacking it from the air, and they weren't able to do that because of the wind and visibility issues. So the fire burned on it, really unattacked for uh, quite a while. And it was not really, I know the first responder uh, response was not about fighting the fire, it was about evacuation and saving lives.
Yeah.
And I know that went on. That was the primary objective for the first probably 24 hours.
For the incident, and as this information was trickling in, we had heard through our fire liaison that the focus had shifted from fighting the fire to a rescue operation.
Okay.
And we still, at that time, we didn't know the exactly what magnitude this was going to be. And also, the fire damage had ripped through our county communication systems and those backup systems, and then the backup to the backup systems.
Wow.
So we were struggling with information within the EOC and doing the best we could. For example, normally we would, our incident action plans produced within the first few hours. We had no way to distribute that electronically. So one of my cell phones still had service. So I took a picture of, laid out the handwritten incident action plan, which we would typically do um, on, within our documents, and print them out and have them produced and photocopied. So we were adapting by the loss of a lot of our technology.
Hmm.
Another factor of the early EOC was that early on, we had heard that the town of Paradise's Emergency Operations Center had also evacuated and located in the city of Chico. So we were looking for an opportunity to join with them in the city of Chico and move out of our EOC in the city of Orville. We were able to get most of our equipment moved and staged in the city of Chico's EOC. And then the rest of our EOC staff were going to follow. Unfortunately, it timed though with all of the evacuation from our fire damaged communities that then plugged all the access around the city of Chico. So we were not able to completely relocate our EOC.
Right.
Where some of us were in Orville and our equipment was in Chico. And interestingly, though, that benefit, having our computers and printers in the city of Chico, enabled then the town's relocated EOC to use our equipment there. And so it was helpful. We were able to still function within
Okay.
Orville's EOC.
Wow. So I think you highlight the chaos that can ensue in the early stages of a disaster. And you can lose communications. So and the backup to the backup was
To the
lost.
backup,
And,
yep.
and so you have to adapt. You have to be willing and able to, find the best in the situation that you're faced with. I know that in the spillway incident, we weren't able to use our EOC, right, because
Yeah.
it was potentially going to be inundated if there
Yep.
was a major release of water from a dam problem. So those are the kinds of things that are real world. And maybe I don't know if you necessarily train for that or plan for that in preparation, but certainly the ability to adapt. And I think it shows also the partnership within the county between cities and the town of Paradise and the county. How the city of Chico really made their resources available, in great lengths to the town of Paradise and the county, and then the county did a lot, I know, during the EOC to help the town of Paradise. So there was great mutual assistance between jurisdictions.
Yeah, and then when you have a disaster that crosses jurisdictions and that affects a number of our local communities as well as the North State, it's important to have that perspective of better to serve our community and resolve the boundaries later, because this disaster didn't have boundaries.
Okay. And so this disaster, was beyond anything we could have imagined. I know that I've heard our fire chief talk about, when you're planning in the future, pick the worst case scenario and then multiply it by 10. And that's what you need to be planning for to deal with something like the Camp Fire, a fire that moves so fast through the town of Paradise. Within hours, the town of Paradise was decimated.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And what we heard from our fire professionals is that the fire behavior was not like anything they have seen.
Yeah.
To wave through an entire town and our unincorporated communities, and my brain still doesn't get around 14,000 homes being destroyed.
Right.
And we've had that number. We understand the statistics. We've have it mapped, but it takes a while to get your brain around what that is.
So how in the EOC, how long did the EOC go on for with the Camp Fire?
We had over 16 operational periods. It went on, I think, for over a month. I was in the first series of the operational periods, and then was pulled out to be part of the team that then worked on the Disaster Recovery Operations Center for the county that was ongoing as well. So we were still in an active disaster and then needing to plan for the disaster recovery, coming off of a year that we hadn't completely resolved the previous year's disaster.
Right. Man. So there's a resource issue now in play, and this is not able to be accomplished just with county staff anymore, right?
Right. So we had called in for mutual aid. So we had a number of cities and counties have their staff come into our EOC. We have relied on our retired employees that were available and could come back to serve in the EOC is very important. And to the outreach and support from our fellow cities and counties in the state of California was tremendous.
Yeah.
We had a lot of connection with other counties, Shasta, Napa, Sonoma, that had recent disasters that gave us their time, some of their resources and personnel to help us through what we were going through, and that was incredible.
And that the system, the SIMS and NIMS and SIMS, that system of mutual aid that's tied into all the disaster declaration process, and that's what allows for us to be able to utilize mutual aid to gather resources from other jurisdictions, right?
Yeah, very important. And then it comes back to the standardization in an EOC of roles, titles, and tasks, so that someone else will come into that organization, into our EOC, and to have some familiarity and lay the land and how things work, as well as how to access state resources, federal resources if those are available, if it's federally declared, and then what is required for the reimbursement of those costs.
Right. So the reimbursement of tracking costs, filling out the proper paperwork is pretty critical, right, for reimbursement?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Yep. A whole series of the right paperwork to fill out your G14s, the correct entries in our timesheet systems, and cost tracking, the ordering under logistics, the kinds of things that were being ordered. In a previous disasters, we may have had 250 to 300 order requests going out, and in the Camp Fire disaster, it was something like 10 times that, 2,500 to 3,000 procurement. And our procurement staff are still going through the documentation and processes for the kinds of things that were required to procure during that disaster.
Right. So there's a lot of money at stake for reimbursement for county costs, and there's this whole federal, state, local sharing of costs for these large disasters. And I know in the Camp Fire situation that even the county's share and the town's share was so large that it took legislation really to bail out the county and the town for some period of time, because that cost could have bankrupted the jurisdictions.
Yeah, yeah.
And all that comes back to good documentation. So what would be your message to someone who's working in the EOC and is needing to make sure they document for reimbursement?
Follow the correct ordering and requisition procedures. There's specific paperwork for that. You have your 214s, which is a standardized form for filling out your time as it relates to your activities in the EOC. Seek simplification where you can to achieve, efficiencies. The simpler things are, I think, the more readily people will use them. And then ensure that you've got your forms that you filled out documented and filed, so that at a later date, when there is an audit or a review of those materials, they can connect the activities to the costs.
So you should wait until the end of the incident to start filling out your paperwork?
No, all that is continual. It is a cycle of paperwork and documentation and procedures. that are important, and we have systems to save those informations in our directories, um, and that is key. And the more you can seek, if you're going through this for the first time, the more you can seek advice or processes from another jurisdiction, the better off you'll be.
Right. So it's a daily kind of thing, though. You want to keep short tabs on
Yeah.
your expenses and requests and all that, and your time.
Yep.
Okay. All right. Well, you mentioned the Disaster Recovery Operations Center, the DROC. I think we'll talk about that in our part 2 of this conversation, because that's the post disaster process, and we'll talk about how land use planning shows up in that. I think we're about done with this section. Is there anything else, Pete, you want to add about the EOC and the role of land use planners and just how to be better equipped and prepared?
Well, I think a bridge between the EOC and then the disaster recovery processes is your local hazard mitigation plan.
Okay.
So something that we have in place and have for a number of years. But the LHMP, or local hazard mitigation plan, is a required element, right? It also has to be connected to your general plan. Those two things together then are a piece of what the state looks at in order to qualify for reimbursement of disaster costs.
Okay.
And that was really key here in Butte County, to have an LHMP and your general plan safety element connected and consistent with state law, in order so that there's no further questions about our qualifying for reimbursements.
And reimbursement is definitely a big deal. So that's a huge point to make. Thank you for making that. We'll probably touch on that in the next section as well.
Mhm.
So with that, thank you, Pete Calarco, Assistant Director with Butte County Department of Development Services. And with that, we're going to wrap it up. Thank you very much.
All right. Thank you.